You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 283 of the Meet the Farmers podcast. I'm your host, Ben Eagle. Last week, hundreds of farmers travelled to London for the NFU conference, which is our subject for today's episode. Predictably, the topic of inheritance tax dominated discussions, and Secretary of State Steve Reed certainly had a challenge on his hands when addressing the room. There was also a somewhat unexpected vegan protest, with two protesters supposedly dressed as carrots jumping onto the stage. But that aside, what were the discussions and general sentiment in the room? Well, I'm joined today by two farmers who were in the room. Beef and sheep farmer Rebecca Morgan, who is also Chair of Ludlow NFU, and she's also on the consultancy team for agri and rural PR and marketing agency Pinstone. So she has several hats. She's with us. And also, I'm really pleased to be joined by Cambridgeshire arable farmer Tom Martin, long-standing friend of the show, is also with us. Welcome to you both. We are recording this on Friday, so happy Friday to you both.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
Where shall we start? I suppose, can you just give us your general takeaways from the conference? What were your overall feelings? Rebecca, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I will. So overall, I think you can't really dismiss that it was a bit of a downbeat conference. It was always going to be overshadowed by the inheritance tax issue. And as expected, there wasn't really any real answers on that particular subject. But there were reasons to be optimistic. There were actually some fairly decent announcements from Steve Reed when he did address the audience that were positive, that can help kind of farmers on a day-to-day basis. There were some positive stories around some of the export opportunities. So there were glimmers of optimism. I think the day sort of culminated on a slight downer again when we heard from one of the chief economists about the state of the economy and what might be to come the autumn budget.
Tom, your overall thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think at the interviewed afterwards, Tom Bradshaw, the NFU president, said about Steve Reed's speech, it would have been an okay speech had it not been for the spectre of IHT. And I think probably that the whole conference was relatively similar. It was a good, interesting conference. It's good to get more people there. The one-day format certainly worked in that respect. But I have to say, at the end of the first session, I know we'll come on to this, but I was kind of waiting for the second session to start, and I thought, don't really care about anything else. What does anything else? Does anything else matter? It just was a bit like, oh, and here's the rest of the day. So it was absolutely dominated by that political session and generally the strength of feeling in the room.
I think it's hard to be optimistic when you've got that hanging over your head. And how can farmers see past that at the moment when it is such a significant challenge for their business, that they're worried about their future, they're worried about maybe elderly parents or children. There's so many concerns around it that it was always going to sort of be what everybody was going to kind of hear about, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, just to give listeners some context as well for your businesses as well. I mean, just give us an idea of your businesses.
Yeah, very, very happy to. We're a kind of medium-sized family farm. We've, as everybody probably met with a tax advisor, had an absolute coffee spitter of a figure. One, as to the kind of value of land and everything in relation to the kind of profitability of the business, but also the tax liability, assuming this comes in April 2026. And it probably therefore felt the same as everybody else about how difficult this will be, a tax on misfortune rather than a tax on profit. So that's kind of where we're sitting at the moment. We're making no investments whatsoever.
Yeah.
Making no steps forward, no plans for growth. Or plans for growth are all subject to this. And everybody I speak to in the kind of surround the allied industries, when I say, well, actually, we're not going to order anything more of this at the moment, or we're holding back on whatever, they're saying we're hearing this across the board. So I'm sure our position is reflected in around kitchen tables across the country.
From what I hear as well, that was a fairly clear thing from the conference as well. I think there was a show of hands as to who's actually investing in their business, who's going to be investing in their business. And I think there were only a couple of people who actually
maybe
put
two
their hands up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rebecca?
So we are a modest family beef and sheep farm in South Shropshire, but despite being a modest farm, we're going to well exceed the sort of threshold around the inheritance tax, and actually we are stuck right in the crosshairs. So currently our family business is owned by my husband's mother, singly owned by my husband's mother, and she's 88. We've not been negligent with our tax advice and our planning. We have taken quite regular advice, and up until very recently, the advice has been for her to keep the assets in hand and to keep the land in hand. So we are in such a predicament because we don't know whether to start trying to change things out. I mean, if we transferred land now, the likelihood that she's going to live 7 years is very, very slim, if I'm honest. She's not in the best of health. She's 88, and I think you can't take any day for granted when you're 88 years old. Or do we just stay as we are and think, well, maybe she's not going to be around till next April, which is a horrible thought, quite frankly, but that's the situation that we're stuck in. And what was really irritating at the conference, and there was many farmers that sort of stood up and echoed a similar situation to us with elderly parents, and Steve Reed kept saying, I cannot comment on individual cases. And everybody was thinking, these are not isolated individual cases. These are the plights of many farmers in the room, and certainly across the wider farming community. We are stuck in this exact situation where we've got elderly parents in possession of the land. And I think it's going to implicate everybody, no matter what your particular situation. But some people maybe have a bit longer to try and plan around it, or other options that they can kind of maneuver to work their way out of this situation. But for us, it just feels impossible, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that phrase especially, can't comment on individual cases. He also said that it's a difficult but necessary decision. I mean, Rebecca, you spend half your life working in PR. So, I mean, if you were working in PR for the government at the moment, I mean, I can't really see that they're playing. What are they doing at the moment? This surely isn't. What is the game they're playing?
That's a great question. I mean, he is just completely towing the party line. There is no acceptance that any of their figures might be wrong, or I guess from a PR perspective, what they're being advised is do not cast any shadow of a doubt over what we are doing and why we're doing this. And we've seen it from the Prime Minister by sort of bringing in a motive issue with the NHS and saying, well, this, quite frankly, is a decision between the NHS and between farmers having kind of reductions in tax. And that simply isn't true, but it's very clever from a PR perspective, because it's obviously going to try and keep the public on side. People are going to think, oh God, yes, you've got to choose the NHS. And actually, as farmers, we'd probably say, well, yes, the NHS is an absolute top priority, but the reality is the funds that are going to be raised from this tax would fund the NHS for one day. So it's a complete mistruth, and a really sort of clever sort of PR tactic, I guess, to try and keep the public on side with this policy.
And I think with that, it's completely undone by the Treasury meeting the previous week, where the big farming unions made a suggestion which I think on paper is likely to bring in more tax revenue and actually achieve what the kind of current policy wants to do, i.e. to support family farms and to deter people moving into land just to avoid tax. So there was all these kind of incongruent positions. It's very difficult. He can say this, but actually it's undone by this, or he can make this assertion, but it's completely undone by the latest numbers, or by any one of a number of external independent bodies, or it's been completely superseded by what we now know. It was quite weird, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the classic deflecting the questions, short responses, talked about the same stuff that he has said at every conference I've been to. We faced this black hole. We had no idea of the size of this black hole, and we had to make regrettable decisions to deal with this black hole. So to be fair to him, he has kept consistent with what he's been saying. He has not deviated from that at all through any platform that he's spoken on since this came out.
And I think there were a number of lows in a session of lows from his perspective. One of the lows from me was, I am very sorry for the shock that you may have felt. And I just thought, oh gosh, there's just felt like there was no humanity. And I thought, I thought he did well to turn up. He could have. The easiest thing would have been to avoid the conference. It would be very difficult to not be there. But he was there. He certainly, absolutely didn't vary from the party line. He certainly delivered exactly the same things that they've been delivering for some time, and did that in the face of a number of different questions. Certainly a lot of kind of counterpoints put by Tom Bradshaw and Charlotte Smith, and certainly faced a room of. We were respectful, but there was certainly a lot of grumbling and complaining and moaning and just a sigh. Oh gosh, not that tired position again. Really, is that what you've come to tell us?
Talked a little bit about Steve Reed. What did you think of Tom Bradshaw's performance?
I personally think Tom is doing a great job at the helm at the moment. I think he comes across with a authenticity. You can see the emotion in his face. He comes across very natural. He's doing this for all of the right reasons, and he's putting his, blood and sweat into fighting this, to be honest. And it comes across just like that. And I don't think anybody could say anything negative probably about Tom. I think he came across well.
Yeah, there was tough tenure so far.
Gosh, absolutely. But I think he's certainly rising to it. There was a moment when he spoke, and he said, and the thing which really, effectively gets to me is the older farmers. And his voice just broke a little bit, and he kind of stood there in this almost Superman pose, his fists clenched by his side, his sleeves rolled up, and I think it really reflected the emotion and the seriousness of the situation, but also the grit in which we as an industry are facing this. He said that the government thought that the news would disappear after a week and the farmers would disappear after a month. But he said, not only will we not, but we cannot. We absolutely cannot. And I thought that was a really good point to make. I thought he spoke, very well. He's a personable, likable person, but he's also somebody you can tell has got the bit between his teeth and is prepared to take the industry anywhere reasonable to get this overturned.
What about the rest of Steve Reed's speech? Your take on that? There were a number of things announced, but it seems like, which I think you've already really said, whatever he were to announce, the IHT, the inheritance issue, would still dominate the whole thing.
Yeah, I think so. There were some welcome announcements in the rest of his speech, such as he talked about improving supply chain fairness, which I think everybody would agree needs to improve, with changes to pig contracts. I think in particular was going to come in as soon as the spring. So that feels like action and feels like a positive step forward. I know he also announced 30 million funding for legacy HLS agreements, who people on those agreements to date have been at a real unfair advantage, despite being kind of the original stewards of the countryside and the first to kind of get on the environmental stewardship kind of activity. So those were real positives. I think funding secured for FIPL going forward. I know that's been quite a popular scheme that quite a few farmers have benefited from. Reopening of the capital grant scheme was another one that's caused a bit of a ruckus when that suddenly ceased and closed, and everybody was wondering whether that was going to reopen again. So those were some of the big ones that he talked about, I think.
Somebody was talking about warm words, and it felt like warm words, but not fresh warm words. They were kind of reheated warm words, weren't they? It was almost, we abruptly stopped the capital scheme, and now, good news, we're reopening it. We've been underpaying farmers in HLS. Actually, we're an example. over the years. And good news, we're now going to pay them just the same as everybody else, so they won't be disadvantaged. And there was the comment about the public procurement. Good news, we're going to encourage the public sector to be procuring British produce. And I just looked into it, and actually the French government did the same thing in 2010 when the Labour Party were last in power, and cemented that in their legislation in 2018. So it just felt. It was. I mean, it was we were in a difficult position anyway, but it just felt pretty underwhelming and just a reheat of last night's TV dinner.
There was also mention of this farm profitability unit, which we don't have much detail on at all. But I mean, Rebecca, what do we know about that?
I think your guess is as good as ours, Ben, on what a farming profitability unit looks like. He didn't actually shed any light on detail in the actual speech. He just used, when he was talking about the only thing he can do to help farmers is improve their profitability, and that in turn will help them afford to pay the inheritance tax liabilities. So he then proceeded to announce that he would be opening up this farming profitability unit. I don't really know what that looks like, to be honest. I guess it's possibly a culmination of different measures, but I think if he thinks he can just step in and transform farm profitability overnight, or even in years, or even in decades, it's quite challenged, to be honest, given the headwinds that we face, given the factors outside of our control, quite frankly. I think he's probably rather overambitious.
Yeah, I mean, just that statement, the positioning statement of "I will consider my time as Secretary of State as a failure if I cannot address farm profitability." I mean, that was a big, bold statement. In a year without all this IHT going on, it would still be a pretty big, bold statement, something which Secretary of States have failed at through the decades. And yet it just felt like it was just ridiculous. We don't believe you. You've lost the room. You've lost the industry. And almost, whatever you say, nothing is going to cut the mustard apart from a reverse on IHT.
I'm trying to find some positive here, which and we will go on to some things. But I mean, if we look at farming at the moment generally, I mean, if you're a beef farmer, there is some things to be smiling about there in terms of actually the livestock sector generally is looking pretty buoyant. In fact, to be honest, unless you're an arable farmer, which is probably slightly less to be buoyant about at the moment, Tom, maybe there are positives in the industry, aren't there?
Yeah, do you know, I fortunately met our new MP for the first time before the 31st of October. And my message to him was actually we're pretty buoyant. So, the SFI has come in and it's had a bit of a stumbling start, but actually it's been finessed and improved, and payments have been made more appropriate and more available. It's there is a positivity. We are feeling, I think, more proactive and more able to look ahead, look into the future, and to plan perhaps than we have done probably since the Brexit vote. And yet that was undone with one decision. And don't forget, at that time, before the 31st of October, we were also flying on a promise that BPS and BPR and APR wouldn't be touched. So actually, it felt quite secure at the time. I think it's just that it's this single issue which also undoes everything else, because we've heard one thing and yet the opposite action happened. And I thought Steve Reed was incredibly woolly, and I just wondered whether he was thinking, well, I've been ridden over by the Treasury once when I and even Keir Starmer have made a promise about inheritance tax, and so now I almost can't say anything. I'm going to have to be so lukewarm and so woolly in case I have to do another almighty climb down.
What do you think it's going to take for the Labour Party as a whole, I suppose, to regain the confidence of farmers?
I think Rachel Reeves has probably got to resign and move out of the equation. And I think, to be honest, unless they make let's face it, they're never going to do a full U-turn on this policy. That's not going to happen. I think some sensible concessions and amendments to it, I think, would go a long way. But did you know what? That trust is truly broken in Labour government. And I naively thought, actually, when it was the election, do you know what? We surely can't be much worse off under a Labour government than.
A lot
I
of
wasn't
people
a
were thinking it.
massive fan
Yeah.
of what the Tories had done to us previously. I was pretty disappointed with some of their moves. And I thought, do you know what? It surely can't be that much worse. And then this came, and honestly, yeah, it's going to take years to get them, get the rural vote back. This is going to harm Labour for years and years to come.
Yeah, I think whether there's a reversal on IHT or not, you're right. Any future Secretary of State speaking at any future NFU conference, announcing anything will have, well, you promised us you wouldn't touch IHT, and then you did, thrown back at them, because that's the that's the trust that's lost, and it's not necessarily anchored in Steve Reed and Rachel Reeves, but although obviously clearly they're the face of it, the main proponents, but I think this. Gosh, for this Parliament, the trust of the agriculture industry is gone. I think there could be a U-turn. I think they could review and accept the farming union's proposal. I think they could have their budget amended in the House of Lords and just shrug and say, well, it was very difficult to fight against the Lord. We had to make some concessions, and one of them was IHT for farmers, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there are ways to bring this in, but I would also say, I mean, I've said before that there's no shame in changing your mind. I really would want them to know that, especially as more information comes out and a very credible alternative is proposed, that there is no shame in changing your mind. And if I was Steve Reed making the case to change the government position, I would still feel that I could come to future NFU conferences and speak with confidence and say, yes, we got that wrong, we changed our mind, and we're now ready to look forward. But at the moment, this is not going to go away.
And that was something that, I don't know if you watched the debate in Parliament, but that was what MPs trying to lobby against the Labour MPs was saying, that there's no shame in making a U-turn, and we've had to do it before, for example, and trying to make it easy for them. And I think, having watched that debate, there are Labour MPs now speaking out against their party, and I think if that grows and there's real momentum behind that, that is what will force a U-turn or some concessions or change. And in terms of, I spoke to the NFU's director of communications at the conference, and he was saying they're very much focused on working on those Labour MPs and getting them to speak out, and that is where a lot of efforts focus. I think the difficulty for NFU is keeping all the membership on board while they execute their strategy, because there is such a strength of feeling. People are so concerned, and it's quite easy after, especially off the back of the Treasury meeting, which was an absolute joke, for people to think, do you know what, the NFU strategy is not working, they need to be more aggressive. That's certainly what I'm hearing, because I'm obviously, in my role as branch chair, speaking to a lot of grassroots farmers who aren't necessarily quite so well connected with some of the people within the NFU, and that's what they're saying. Well, they need to step it up, we need to be more aggressive, they're not getting anywhere, and their expectations are very high. And if the NFU lose grassroots support from farmers for what they're doing, I think it does put them in a tricky situation.
Right at, I suppose, the final session was the Henry Plum Lecture, which this year was given by Paul Johnson, who is director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And Rebecca, before we started recording, we had a little bit of a chat about this, but your take on that, and from what I hear, there wasn't much positive to be taken from that either.
It was pretty gloomy, the final section. I don't think there was any sugarcoating the state of the economy, to be honest. And I think the main sort of sentiment that came across was some of the predictions from the Office of Budget Responsibility have been rosy-eyed, I think, to say the least. So actually the situation is probably going to be much worse than we actually think. And he suggested that, Rachel Reeves is going to be breaking some of her ironclad kind of fiscal rules come the autumn budget. And that is possibly going to lead to further difficult decisions around kind of public money and where that's going to go. Some sentiment, I guess it put it in perspective. Obviously, for everybody in the room, we were hyper-focused on inheritance tax and the implications on farmers and what it's doing to us in its an industry. But if you look at the wider economy as a whole, there is trouble everywhere and lots of businesses are being affected. And it's kind of where do we sit in terms of that pecking order? How much to government value what we're delivering as an industry. So I'd like to think that they won't touch the farming sector anymore in the November budget, but there was a bit of a sentiment of perhaps we just need to shut up and think ourselves lucky, given the context of the whole economy at the moment. So there wasn't an awful lot to be optimistic about. And actually, he wasn't that familiar with our woes as a farming industry and was almost a little bit dismissive of them. But from his perspective, I guess he probably can't understand as an economist why farmers farm like they do for such low profitability anyway. He probably can't get his head around that in any sense, but I think he was almost thinking our problems are rather trivial in the grand schemes of the wider economy. Maybe that's what's in the head of all of those sort of people in Westminster and wider economists, that actually this is a relatively minor issue, albeit hugely important and damaging to us as an industry.
We are gonna sort of start to round it up in a bit, but before we do, let's draw. I want some sort of positive comment from some of you. I mean, definitely, if we look in dairy, Rich Clothier from White Farms, he spoke about export opportunities. Clearly, as a cheese man, particularly in relation to dairy. We also had some positive talk from Angus Davison, who also spoke on similar lines with regards to his berry products. And when it comes to export, there's some positive to be had, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the talks from Wyke and Haygroves were the most uplifting of the whole conference from my perspective. And it would appear, I mean, you can see those are two hugely successful businesses, and I think every farmer in the room would very, very much love to be able to stand on a stage and be able to tell the stories that they've told, because they've come from similar routes at some point in their time, but they've obviously had an ambition and an entrepreneurial spirit in them that has enabled them to grow these hugely successful businesses. But I think from Wyke's perspective, I mean, they're exporting cheese and dairy products all around the world. They played a really corny video of it was an American TV kind of channel like advertising the cheese, and it was hilarious, but demonstrated the point of what Americans value from a British perspective in terms of our heritage. They think it's all green and pleasant land, but that narrative behind the produce that we've got actually is so powerful, and it's enabled businesses like White to be able to open up these kind of export opportunities and be really successful all over the world. And I think they were selling into China as well as America and various different growing markets. And a similar story from Angus Davison, talking about his berries, exporting berries all over the world, multiple different countries, as well as his polytunnels, which was quite interesting. At one time, he wasn't exporting any polytunnels, but because of the climate change challenges that are happening, he's seeing an increasing kind of demand for them in various areas of the world, which he actually led him on to talk about another opportunity for British growers in terms of our climate. And in the future, the not so distant future, as scary as it might be from a climate change perspective, there'll be parts of the world that won't be able to grow food, and it will be more reliant on countries such as ours who have got a very good food growing climate. So those were definitely reasons to be optimistic. Angus Davison also threw down a bit of a challenge to the industry about increasing domestic consumption and getting British producers to actually understand the value of British produce and want to buy it. So he suggested that actually NFU, HDB, all this sort of organisations to sort of club together and execute a consumer campaign in the UK to try and encourage support for British produce, which was kind of an interesting view on things. And maybe it is a good idea, although I'm not sure his budgets he suggested would necessarily stretch quite as far as he thinks in terms of a consumer campaign. But I think growing domestic consumption for our produce actually really is key as well.
Yeah, I mean, both those examples. Sorry, but both those examples, two very successful businesses. I mean, are they? How much can we then, I suppose, read that positivity into other, perhaps smaller farmers? Is that kind of positivity relevant for everyone?
I would say probably not. I think it's very difficult for a lot of farmers in the room to see how they could ever get to that point. I mean, they talked about going to international trade fairs to go and show off their produce and stuff. For the day-to-day farmer, that is never going to be an option. I think it's going to require a more significant shift overall in the market and opportunities to be opened up rather than individual. It's not an option for individual farmers to be doing it, really.
That's true, but I actually found that quite inspiring. Both the attitude of both those characters was great, and for me, that investment to grow session, which was just after lunch, maybe we'd all had a bit of a good feed, maybe we'd got over the political session from the morning, but that was the highlight of my day, really. I mean, Angus Davison was fantastic, kind of brimming with ideas, really inspirational what he'd done, and he sat alongside Ray Newton-Smith, the chief executive of the CBI, who really said, we are completely on board with you as farmers. I mean, and not only, you're great, you're the backbone of the economy, you're all these sorts of things, but also said, if I could summarize what she said, only an idiot would think it was a good idea to tax you as you pass land to the next generation, and I felt quite inspired that we've got somebody, farmers saying this is crazy. I can understand, but it's actually getting other people to be, other eminent voices to be speaking to government in the same way. So I thought that was a really, really positive session. I thought Angus was relatively positive, but he played through. He spoke through. He acted out a conversation between himself and a Chinese investor looking at investing in the UK, and it was really good looking at the opportunity size of market, how it's not developed, and as you were saying, it then ended up with the video and the challenge that actually we need to move the British consumer to buy more British produce, to perhaps see British produce elevated at the same level as they do in the rest of the world, and that will make a difference. But really, where it was the Chinese, the hypothetical Chinese investor wasn't looking to invest in the UK until we can move that UK consumer. So I think there were notes of caution sown throughout the entire conference, but certainly a highlight for me was that session after lunch.
Yeah, I mean, Rebecca, I think Tom has outlined quite nicely out there the challenge in terms of taking this to the public. From a PR point of view, this is a very unfair question, but how does the industry meet that challenge?
That is a really good question. I think the trouble with any consumer PR campaign or advertising campaign is the cost associated with it. And I think AHDB have obviously done a really good job with their sort of Eat Balance campaign. I know it's slightly different to what Angus was describing in terms of getting across some of those other points. But, that campaign has cost an awful lot of money. And I think it's being able to, drum up enough money to be able to execute a good campaign. I think there's stuff you can do more at grassroots level and try and encourage farmers to engage with the public more, to tell them their individual stories, what we're doing from aspects from the environment to welfare, all of these things that we do every day. We're actually really poor at doing that. But I don't know if that in itself will be enough. I think, we're competing with some organisations that have got a lot of money and kind of countering our arguments on some stuff. So I think, we do need to have a big kind of bold campaign probably that's united, that everybody sort of joins in on, but it's notoriously difficult to achieve in practical terms, I think.
I think it's a challenge, but and kind of in the modern time when almost the most respected voices are those around us. I almost feel like the best PR is the stuff you can't pay for. So there may be something we can do as an industry of farmers with amazing views and beautiful countryside. Maybe there is something we can do. I thought I was momentarily buoyed by the thought of that.
Well, I think we're going to take that as a positive then, Tom. But I suppose just bringing this together, based on what you heard at the conference, I suppose what would you say is the mood among farmers at the moment? What words would you use for that? But also, are you personally feeling more hopeful or more concerned about the future of UK ag after attending the NFU conference?
Not more hopeful at all. I mean, it was very clear we are not for moving. I'm desperately concerned about my business, about our income, about the support of government, about opportunities for the future. It felt pretty dark, and of course there were lighter notes, but it was pretty poor. I felt that we had a Secretary of State no apologies for going back to this, but a Secretary of State who had the balls to turn up but hasn't got the balls to fight for British farmers, or the balls to admit that they've got something wrong and they're going to change their mind. So it was disappointing, I think, is the kind of British understatement. And I think we're brooding as an industry. I think we are at the moment licking our wounds. I really hope that Tuesday's protest event on Pancake Day really gets some traction. But there are people who are increasingly desperate, and that's not just the elderly people thinking, gosh, it's better for my family if I die before next April, which is horrendous. But there are people thinking, if we don't fight this, then our entire industry is going to be crippled by it. And as ever, if government aren't able to respond to their constituents, then sometimes people take the law into their own hands and do stupid things like go and block up this, or park the tractor somewhere, or follow the French and tip manure, which we don't want. We don't want, because that the optics are terrible. 2, we lose the public, and 3, therefore we lose the politicians. But I think we're in an era of heightened desperation.
Rebecca, are you more hopeful or more concerned?
I'm not very hopeful either, I'm afraid. I'd like to be more optimistic, and I am an optimistic person by nature, but we have to be realistic with what we're facing here. I think there's nothing that came out of conference that made me feel any more hopeful that there was going to be some concessions or some sort of change in terms of the inheritance taxing. And as an industry, although we know from our history that we are resilient and we do pull together and we seem to be able to muscle through some quite significant challenges that we have seen, this feels monumental, I have to say, and it is really difficult to see past this at the moment. And I just hope that, although Steve Reed towed the party line, I hope that the conversations happening behind closed doors are more constructive, although on the face of it we're still getting the same narrative. The optimist in me thinks that actually maybe behind closed doors they are having some constructive conversations, and certainly the feeling from having talked with MPs, talked with Labour MPs kind of off the record, is that maybe the government thought this was an oven-ready policy and they are now just looking at the details of it. So that still gives me a bit of hope, which I shall hold on to. But I think, quite frankly, unless something changes, which we're not expecting anything to change until at least the autumn now, I think it looks really, really tough for farmers going forward.
Well, on that note, we will leave it there. This is clearly a story that is going to continue, and we will return to it, no doubt. But that is it for today. A big thank you to my guests, Rebecca Morgan and Tom Martin. Thanks to them for coming on the show. Thank you also for listening. Next time, we will be having an episode fully focused on succession. I'll be joined by 2 members of the newly formed Succession Alliance. So please join me for that. But for now, I'm Ben Eagle. This has been Meet the Farmers, and thank you very much for listening. Meet the Farmers is brought to you by RuralPod Media, the only podcast production agency to specialise in the rural sector. We're on a mission to make rural stories mainstream and help businesses, organisations and communities like you tell your story through podcasting. Podcasting is a fantastic way of connecting with your audience, whoever that might be, getting your message out there and networking with leaders in your niche. RuralPod Media can help you by launching your new podcast or helping you with the technical side. We also provide podcast training and an audit service if you already have a podcast, you're not sure where to take it to next. For more information or to book a call, visit ruralpodmedia.co.uk. That's ruralpodmedia.co.uk.